It's great to welcome to the program today Stephen Kinzer, who's an author, journalist, former New York Times correspondent. The newest book is Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. Stephen, so great to have you on.
Good to be with you.
So there are a lot of these buzzwords that will often trigger a lot of conspiratorial thinking, but that often have a real story behind them that is not as nefarious as some make it out to be, but still worthy of discussion. So the Bilderberg Group is one that is often under this umbrella. Area 51 is another example. MK Ultra, I would also consider one of those, where if you do a cursory internet search, you will find a lot of crazy stuff, but it is a real program that existed. So where do we start? What's the best way to kind of start our understanding of what this was?
So this is my 10th book, and I've tried to devote myself over my career to trying to figure out a little bit of what goes on behind the facade of public politics and public diplomacy that we can see. In the course of my research, I've come up with a lot of things that are surprising and some things that may have shocked some people, but this is the first time I've been shocked. I still can't believe that this project MK Ultra was as intense and horrific as it was, and I can't believe that this unknown figure, Sidney Gottlieb, actually existed. So my book is an attempt essentially to write the biography of a guy who in many ways wasn't there. He was, even within the CIA, almost completely unknown in terms of what he was actually doing. MK Ultra was a real program. It lasted for some 10 years. It was aimed at finding the secret of mind control. And in pursuit of that secret, Sidney Gottlieb, who became the chief chemist of the CIA, carried out the most extreme experiments on human subjects that have ever been carried out by any agency or officer of the US government. He had concluded that before you could figure out how to insert a new mind into somebody's brain, you first had to find a way to blast away the mind that was in there. And he spent 10 years working on combinations of drugs, electroshock, and all kinds of other techniques aimed at finding ways to destroy a human mind and a human body and a human soul.
Did this start sort of in response to the belief that Russia already had figured out how to do this and that the US was behind in a sense? What was the role of the Cold War in sort of triggering or fomenting this project?
You can't understand this project without understanding the era. So in the early days of the Cold War, Americans were made to believe that we had this horrific enemy that was plotting our liquidation day and night. If you bought into that, as most Americans did, it would seem that any defensive mechanism would be justified. The loss of a few lives, or even a few hundred lives, would seem like a tiny price to pay. Now, there were a couple of particular incidents that led the CIA to conclude that indeed the communists, as we called them, had discovered the secret to mind control. One of them was the trial of the Roman Catholic prelate of Hungary, Cardinal Mindszenty. He was put on trial by communist authorities, and he seemed to be speaking in a monotone with glazed eyes as he confessed to crimes that he obviously hadn't committed. Later on, it turned out that he had been coerced with the normal techniques that interrogators use, like extended isolations and beatings and repeated interrogation. But we didn't see it that way. The CIA thought, he has been brainwashed, and somehow the communists are controlling what he's saying. The other episode came after the Korean War, when it turned out that not only had a number of American prisoners signed statements denouncing the United States or even confessing to war crimes, but a number of them decided they wanted to stay behind and they would rather live under a communist society than come back to America. This was interpreted also at the CIA as something that only could have become possible if they had been brainwashed. So I asked myself a second question, though. What was it that led CIA officers to embrace this fantasy of mind control and misinterpret these incidents. I think maybe it had to do with the books and stories and movies that these people had ingested as they grew up. There are all kinds of Sherlock Holmes stories and Edgar Allan Poe stories and movies like Svengali and Gaslight. I think they created a kind of a fertile mind in the CIA that led them to be willing to believe something that even Sidney Gottlieb himself, after 10 years of destroying human lives, realized was a myth.
What was the role of the hallucinogenic LSD in all of this? Was LSD mixed in as possibly a tool to be used, or was it misunderstood and actually had nothing to do with this?
Sidney Gottlieb, the director of MK Ultra, was fascinated with LSD. He and his fellow chemists believed that it might be, as one of them put it, the key that could unlock the universe. He thought this might be the mind-controlled drug. He himself, by his own account, used LSD more than 200 times. So in 1953, Sidney Gottlieb persuaded the CIA to buy the entire world supply of LSD. He brought it from Switzerland to the United States, and he used it for two purposes. One was in horrific experiments in American prisons and at secret detention centers around the world. And then there was another piece. He also used it for non-coercive experiments on volunteers who were actually told that they were taking a psychoactive substance. And this leads to one of Gottlieb's most unexpected legacies. So through a couple of bogus medical foundations that he established, Gottlieb sent LSD to dozens of clinics and hospitals and universities around the country and paid them to call for volunteers who would be paid a small amount and take LSD. Who were among the first people who volunteered? One of them was Ken Kesey, who went on to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He loved LSD so much that he actually took a job in the hospital in Menlo Park, California, so he could steal the LSD out of the medicine chest and bring it home to his friends. Another one was the poet Allen Ginsberg, who took it at a CIA-sponsored experiment at Stanford, of course not knowing that it was CIA-sponsored. Another was Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, who introduced LSD to the other members of the band. So it was through Gottlieb and MK Ultra that LSD leaked out of the laboratory into the general population. And of course, the irony is that the drug that Gottlieb thought might give the CIA the tool to control people's minds actually wound up fueling a generational rebellion that was aimed at destroying everything the CIA believes in.
You mentioned experiments, horrible experiments. What types of things are we talking about?
Gottlieb conducted experiments in the United States and outside the United States. Inside the US, his favorite subjects were prisoners, for obvious reasons. For example, I came across one experiment that was carried out at the federal prison in Kentucky. 7 African-American inmates were segregated into a cell, and without being told what was happening to them, were given triple doses of LSD every day for 77 days. So this was a way for Gottlieb to try to figure out if you could destroy a mind with this kind of an overdose. And actually, of course, the answer is yes, you can. Abroad, Gottlieb's experiments were even more intense. As he started out on the project, Gottlieb, as a good scientist, asked himself, what research is already out there? Who are the experts that exist on how to destroy a human mind and a human body? So the first obvious answer was the Nazi doctors who had worked in the concentration camps. And the CIA hired Nazi doctors not only to help design these so-called experiments, but to help oversee them. I visited, in the course of research for this book, what I think may be the very first CIA secret prison. It's in a lovely chalet outside Frankfurt in Germany. The young German businessman who now owns that house was nice enough to take me into the basement, and he showed me his storage rooms and told me these were the cells where the CIA scientists and their Nazi partners conducted these extreme experiments, which were essentially just continuations of the experiments that the Nazis had been carrying out just a few years ago in the concentration camps right down the road. So who were the victims in these subjects, in these experiments? They were people that the CIA charmingly described as expendables. People who, if they died, nobody would miss. So suspected enemy agents who had been captured, refugees who didn't seem to be connected to anybody. In East Asia, a number of the subjects were captured North Korean prisoners of war. People for whom there would be no, as they called it, disposal problem. And the guy who actually owns this former CIA torture house told me that older people in the neighborhood all know what happened in this house. And in fact, I found an article in Der Spiegel, the German magazine, saying this was the CIA torture house. There were deaths, but the number is unknown. And this guy told me, these older people around here have told me the victims who died, who were experimented to death, were buried in the forests around here in places that are now covered up by shopping malls and apartment blocks.
So in the limited time we have left, two questions. One, what ultimately led to the end of this program? And number two, at the time the program was going on, I presume that it was classified. When was anything public first known about the program?
So MK Ultra did not come to a sharp end. It petered out in the early 1960s. And Sidney Gottlieb, who, although he was his generation's most prolific torturer, was also a scientist, was forced to conclude in the end that mind control doesn't exist. You cannot persuade somebody or make somebody commit murder, for example, if that person is deeply against committing murder. It's just a made-up fantasy. Gottlieb had to admit this. And that led to the end of MK Ultra after 10 years of laying waste to unknown numbers of human lives. It wasn't until the mid-1970s, so another 15 years after the program ended, that the first pieces of information began to leak out. That was when a few people who had been Gottlieb's victims slowly began to understand what might have happened to them. But on the way out of the CIA, when he retired in 1973, Gottlieb destroyed almost all of the records of MK Ultra. So in my work, putting together this book, I've had to piece together a whole variety of sources. And at the end of the book, I have a line which maybe is my favorite line in the book. I write, everything in this book is true, but not everything that's true is in this book. I'm painfully aware that I have only discovered a portion of what MK Ultra was and who Sidney Gottlieb was, but it's certainly as far as anybody's managed to get up to now.
We have been talking about Stephen Kinzer's book, Poisoner-in-Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. Stephen is an author, journalist, and former New York Times correspondent. Stephen, thank you so much for talking to us about the book.
That was great. Thank you.